Good evening, everyone. My name's Ralph Lee. I'm Head of Factual at Channel 4, and as you can see from the huge sign behind me, you're about to witness the Channel 4 annual interview at Sheffield this year with Morgan Matthews. Morgan's latest film, Britain in a Day, showed on BBC Two this Monday and is also being screened here at the festival. It's the latest in a line of work that has earned Morgan an amazing reputation as a director here in the UK and internationally. His recent films have garnered so many awards and nominations. If I started listing them, we'd be here for a very long time, but a few of them, just to give you a sample. Scenes from a Teenage Killing was a BAFTA nomination. The Fallen won both an RTS and a Best Director BAFTA. Beautiful Young Minds got a BAFTA nomination and an RTS nomination. Taxidermy Stuff the World, a BAFTA nomination and an RTS nomination. And My Crazy Parents, an RTS nomination. So that's just a small sample of some of the recognition for Morgan's recent work. I first came across his work when I saw Taxidermy and Beautiful Young Minds, and I felt a very strong sense of the author in these films, of the director. The films the author seemed never to miss or not notice the comedic potential of the subject. These were quite extreme characters who, as a viewer, you could potentially have been drawn to laugh at. But you never laughed at them somehow. Somehow they were being presented to you with a degree of awe and respect that allowed you to question yourself and look for human qualities in yourself that you didn't think you might share with these characters. I thought there was a really interesting touch that came through these films. And Morgan's work, I think, displays these strong characteristics throughout. And I think he, as a character, emerges really strongly in his work. So before I introduce him onto the stage and start grilling him, let's have a view of just one short clip from Beautiful Young Minds. So, Ross, if you can roll clip 17, please.
How close to your parents are you?
I know what I need them for, and I know what they need me for. I need them to be a source of lodgings, accommodation, food, that sort of thing. They need me to access the internet, that sort of thing.
But those are practical things, Josh.
Well, as far as I can make out, all the emotions we ever have, which is probably what you're trying to get at, are created as a result of our interaction with the practical. I don't really know how to incorporate emotions in a purely non-practical way into the issue. If I'm going to make a partly practical, partly emotional study, I might as well remember that any emotional component is ultimately derived from a practical one. Unless I'm missing something about the way human emotions are derived, but I imagine that if there is a non-practical derivation of them, it's one that I would consider too irrational to be interested in.
Previous Channel 4 interviews have focused on some of the kind of current masterminds of factual television. Stephen Lambert, Robert Thurkel, I think Nick Kerwin was last year. But this year we're focusing at a slightly different level. And I think I should reveal that I don't really believe in objectivity in documentary. I think documentary making is so based on individuals, and I think it's a sequence of so many different subjective judgments that you make along the way. The idea that the individual who's making those judgments doesn't himself or herself emerge in the end product, I don't believe in. I think in making films, the individual matters. Where you're from matters. Where you're calling from matters, as Raymond Carver would have put it. So this evening, I hope that in the course of an hour or so, through watching clips, through talking to him, we'll discover a bit about Morgan and where he's calling from. So please join me in welcoming Morgan Matthews. Welcome, Morgan.
Yeah, right.
So before I start grilling Morgan, before I ask you any questions, we're going to play a very brief game with the audience here, which is one of my first questions to Morgan when I met him was, tell me a bit about where your first sort of influences from TV came from. And his first answer surprised me. So this is a clip of Morgan's answer. The first person who can yell out the title of this before the title comes up, I'll buy them a pint later. Who got it first? Life on Earth over there? Up there? Okay, well done. Russell, it's all yours. 1979.
There are some 4 million different kinds of
I was
animals and
5.
plants in the world.
You were 5.
4 million different solutions.
And
to the
David Attenborough was on
problems
TV
of
doing
staying
Life on
alive.
Earth. Why
This is
choose
the
this as
story
one of
of
your formative influences? It came as a surprise to me that you choose a natural history program rather than a documentary.
Well, I mean, I think it was a documentary for me at that time, and I think for so many people in that period, it felt like universal television. It was ageless in that, everybody seemed to be watching it. It was event television, and it was, I mean, quite an extraordinary achievement. And you look at some of these images now, and they stand up today. They're amazingly filmed and quite beautiful. I think as a child, I just focused on this imagery and the way that it was put together, but also on the fact that I learned a great deal. So it was the connection, I suppose, between documentary and learning for me,
Yes.
which was fascinating. But I also became obsessed with animals at that age.
Did you?
And bought the books and Life on Earth and well, I didn't buy them personally at 5 years old, but my parents did, and I developed, I suppose, an almost encyclopedic knowledge of animals, literally by almost memorizing these encyclopedias. And I suppose just it kind of instilled that fascination for me, which was...
So you're
which
engaging
stayed,
with both the content and the craft. Are you interested in the means of capture
I
at
mean,
this
at
point, or is
5,
that
I mean, I think
asking too much?
I'd like to think I did appreciate the craft at 5 years old, but they were extraordinary images. I think we all, anybody, whatever age they were, recognised that. There was a real wow factor. It felt like we were seeing things that you'd never seen before, but you were also learning about evolution and about the way the natural world works, which was just fascinating for me at that time, and I just kind of lapped it up, I absorbed it like a sponge.
I think this was formative for me too, because I was a little bit older than Morgan, but it said to me that the box in the corner of the room was more than about Blue Peter and Ronnie Corbett. Do you know what I mean? That there was sort of fascinating stuff that you could see and learn from it. Did that impact on you too?
No, totally, and that's it made me go out and buy those books and learn that extra information as well. And that information, I mean, I don't think I know any more than I knew about animals at that time, but I still know quite a lot based on what I learned at that age. So
Yes.
It's something that stayed with me, but also the fascination with animals was something that stayed with me for a while. And, right at the beginning, or my sort of early, in my teen years, I suppose I toyed with the idea of making wildlife documentaries. And then there was a point when I realized that actually the process of making wildlife documentaries for me wasn't, it's not that it wasn't interesting, but it wasn't stimulating in the way that I needed to be. And I wanted to hear people telling their stories.
Can you give us a bit of a biography here, like paint a picture of Morgan Matthews, early teens, growing up where, in what kind of context?
Well, I suppose I was... I grew up in Bristol, mostly, and grew up in a single-parent family, although I had a stepfather. And my mother was a community worker for single parents. And I think that that gave me a sort of strong sense of, and still is, by the way, and gave me a strong sense of I suppose, grassroots issues as well. And people who weren't necessarily, it's not that they weren't well represented in society, but people who were not necessarily on the top rung of society either. And that was quite important for me. And also my stepdad had an enlarger, a photographic enlarger, a small kind of makeshift darkroom that he'd knocked up. And he had an interest in photography, and I think my kind of initial interest in documentary, in wildlife photography, if you like, then progressed into photography and photographing people.
So we're going to come on to another clip now, which is we're going to talk through a few of the clips that were from films that Morgan saw sort of as he grew up and as he started to really observe documentary, to try and examine some of those kind of formative techniques and influences. So if we can come on to clip number 2, please.
In the nest, thousands of stinging bees pose a serious threat to Mwunga's life. Before he climbs any higher, he must have the protection of a smoking bundle of leaves.
So this is Phil Agland making a film for Channel 4 in 1987 with production values that Human Planet would have occasionally been envious of. How does this influence you, Morgan? What's the reaction? Why this? What are you getting from it?
Well, I mean, again, I felt like I hadn't seen anything like it before. I felt that we, the viewing public, hadn't seen anything like it before. And although I think I was probably 13, 14 at the time, it was a revelation for me, and on a number of levels. And I mean, firstly, because of the craft of it, which I did recognise at that time. And you look at that sequence, and I just remember thinking, oh my God, how did he do that? How was he? He was in the tree, he was on the floor.
Cameras in 4 different places.
I know, yeah. and I knew that this was one man filming on 16mm. And just was kind of astounded. Now, obviously, he wasn't in all those places at the same time, and there was a certain amount of construct to it. But that's not to say that it wasn't documentary. It almost felt like he was using wildlife photography techniques or wildlife documentary techniques, but applying them to a documentary about people. But at the same time, it wasn't that it was a sort of anthropological study, because what it did, which I hadn't seen before, was it represented people, tribes people in the Cameroon, they were like us. They had the same issues.
There was a lot of dialogue, wasn't there?
They had the same humour.
Chatting.
It was observational filming, and it was translated, and it was completely. There was a bit of voiceover, but there wasn't David Attenborough kind of intervening, talking about them whilst they were in the background. It was their words, and their words were funny and emotional, and their concerns and fears and dreams, etc., were sort of mirrored ours, and that for me was a revelation. It was a sort of soap opera of their lives.
It was also there for the viewer to discover rather than for the director to tell, as it were. It wasn't that was what the documentary was overtly about. It was in your response to it.
Absolutely. I mean, it felt that it felt very observed, and although there were these constructs in place, it felt that the director's voice wasn't present. But I just think that the way that it was crafted together, and particularly the fact that he was actually filming sequences with animals as well, at the same time, all cut into the same sequences as the people. So the people are fishing by the river, and he's filming a jaguar in the background, and then they're startled by the jaguar, and it's very it's an incredible kind of feat of filmmaking that I'm still in awe of. And 25 years later, you watch that, and it still stands up as an amazing piece of filmmaking. And I think I know Phil Agland has returned to the same tribe 25 years later and made another film with them, which I believe is playing here tomorrow. So. Which I'm yet to see, actually, but I'm very interested to see that.
Let's take another leap forward to a much, much more political film. You wanted to talk about 14 Days in May. Do you want to give a little bit of context before we see the clip? Because it's, without giving a very long clip, it's quite important to know a little bit about what's happening here.
Yeah, so again, I think about the same age, 13, 14, and this film came on TV, and that was just utterly compelling from beginning to end. And I felt at that age, outraged watching this film. It's a film made by Paul Heyman, who followed the last 2 weeks of a man on death row in Mississippi, who was convicted of murdering a police officer. Throughout, it's extraordinary access, and throughout the time that he's filming, there are numerous occasions where there could be a stay of execution and numerous appeals, and right up to literally the last few minutes of this man's life. And I can remember watching it and thinking, at some point, you know, people are going to realize that this is wrong, and there's going to be a stay of execution. And I think his name was Edward Earl Johnson, the man on death row. And he's such an extraordinary, gentle, and eloquent character. And there was a huge question mark over his conviction as well. And I think most people watching, and most people in the prison, including the prison wardens, didn't believe he'd actually committed this crime. And so it felt like that soon, so at some point, people were going to wake up and realize this, or the people who were in control were going to realize this, and that he was going to get a reprieve. And ultimately, that didn't happen.
Should we watch the clip? You can see here the kind of climactic scene after being with Edward Earl Johnson and his family for quite some time. Then we arrive at this moment. Then we'll come back to talk about the role of the director in it. If we could roll clip number 3, please.
When we take you inside, they'll have to attach some little round, I forget what you call them, doohickeys that go to the electrocardiograph machine. They may need to remove a little hair to do that. That will happen at about 1/4 And at that point in time, we'll have about 5 minutes before we remove you from the isolation cell, okay? I've got about 11:33. Got about 12 minutes until the medic comes in, and about 17 minutes until we remove you from the room, okay?
Edward, I think we're going to, we would like to leave you with the people here, okay? I think it's time for us to go. We want to say goodbye to you. Our hearts are with you, and we're still praying for you. Take it easy. Good luck. I won't forget you.
So he goes on to be executed, just to give context to that. When we talked about this, Morgan, you were struck not just by the power of this and the sense of injustice that you had watching it, but also there was something about the presence of the filmmaker, the intimacy of the access, and then the actual... We chose that clip in particular because Paul Heyman steps for the first and only time into the frame. Why did you want to talk about that, Morgan? What's relevant to you about that?
I think there were a number of things. I mean, firstly, that the sort of outrage, if you like, that I was feeling, and the questions that I wanted answered, Paul was asking them. And you heard him asking those questions, and he was challenging people, and he was challenging the governor of the prison, not in a sort of current affairs style, but you know, in a very just in a very economical but natural and sort of impressive way, in that it yielded very strong answers that you were, you know, there's this. If you look at the film, it's a great film if anybody hasn't seen it. And there's not much cutting. You know, he asks a question, and the answer is given in full, and they're all almost, bar none, kind of incredible, articulate answers, and very eloquent and very, very powerful. So he was asking the questions that I wanted to ask. But then there was also a point where he kind of crossed the line, if you like, and I recognized that he crossed the line, and by putting himself in the film. So it was almost like what was happening became the fact that he was making a film, not that it was irrelevant, but it became secondary to the relationship that he'd built up with this man over this period of time, and that he stepped in front of the camera. And although we'd seen people, you know, presenting, and I'd seen, you know, Attenborough and people like that overtly presenting, you didn't really have that kind of that kind of filmmaking where a director put themselves in the frame in that way. So not only were you hearing his voice, but then you were ultimately seeing him, and you were seeing him at the crucial moment when you wanted him to step in and do something.
And are you
But
already,
felt that he was
starting
helpless.
to aspire to direct, to make television, to make documentaries at this point? I mean, you're still in your teens.
And what I understood then was the power of documentary,
Yes.
and the purpose of it.
Yes.
And to me, it felt that it was impossible to watch this film and come away believing that the death penalty was a good
Yes.
idea, and that capital punishment was a good idea. It just felt that this was a film that everybody should see, and if their minds weren't already made up, this would make their minds up.
Yes.
So I understood by focusing on the individual, or focusing on the microcosm, the situation of the individual, you were able to tell a much bigger story as well, and a political story, and a story that could change people's minds as well.
The last clip that we're going to talk about in this sort of period of influences, as it were, you chose The Dinner Party by Paul Watson, where the director is playing a very different role. He's not in front of the camera, but his ideas and influences are unmistakable, aren't they? It's a very directed film.
That's it. Yeah, it's. I mean, Paul Watson obviously is a master filmmaker, and to this day continues to make great films. And I think at that period, it was about 96, 97. He was making films. He'd made The Fishing Party, The Dinner Party. They were metaphors for the Conservative Party, and they were presenting a very a tired image of the Conservatives, and it was the sort of last nail in the Conservative coffin at that time. But his opinions, or what he thought of them, it was very apparent to the viewer.
Yes.
So whether it was apparent to them when they were talking to Paul how they were going to come across, I mean, actually people reference the way that they're going to come across and what Paul might do with that footage, or how he might represent them.
Yes, but it doesn't feel like watching an observational documentary, does it? Because he's mixing in the edit many different elements and creating a great layer of subjectivity around it.
It feels very overtly as though you're being led to think certain things about these people.
Yes.
And they have obviously, he's given them a rope, they've hanged themselves, etc. But you feel the hand of the director very strongly.
Yes.
But it's a very artful hand, and I think at the time I was studying film, and this was one of the films that I studied, and I got an interview with Paul Watson for a dissertation that I was writing. And it was very fascinating to talk to him at that time, and he was quite and possibly still is a notorious figure. And I think when I sort of moved into documentary making, there was this sort of sense, when you cold call people as a researcher, as an AP, and you went through the Yellow Pages as you did at that time, and you'd often get people on the end of the phone saying, "Oh, am I going to get stitched up? Are you going to stitch me up?" And I think that's less so now. I don't really experience that so much now. And obviously people are concerned, I mean, especially institutions, about the way they're going to be represented. But I think at that time there was a sense that through some of the documentary making that was going on at that time, and it's almost like the modern Times school of documentary making, which are, for me, a great strand and some fabulous films. But I think what happened at that time was, there were a lot of directors who were very kind of artful with their craft and very fine filmmakers, but those films were quite leading, and we ended up being often quite cynical about the people in those films.
Yeah.
And so that gave the sort of wider viewing public, if you like, a sense that documentary makers stitch you up.
Did you feel that later in your career, when you're making documentaries, you're dealing with that perception among some of your contributors, or do you think it had dissipated by then?
Well, I think ultimately it has dissipated, and people have different reasons for wanting to be in a documentary. But I think hopefully your work speaks. If you have some work behind you, it sort of speaks for itself. And if you're in discussions about access and this sort of thing, and what the kind of film you're going to make, you always have your...
You send them your films rather than Paul Watson films.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, I still think Paul makes amazing films, and it would be wrong to say that Paul went around stitching people up as well, because he didn't do that, and he's made wonderful films.
Yes.
And
Shall we have a look at the clip? Because it's
very
quite useful,
sensitive,
isn't it?
very sensitive films as well.
Here's the hand of Paul Watson in The Family, The Dinner Party, clip number 5.
I don't believe that everybody should have the same ability to earn the same as each other, nor do I believe that people who earn more should pay more tax. I don't dream about an equal society. I mean, an equal society is not one that I think is something that I would love to see in my lifetime.
It's a bottle about Rastas, who was a big black man. You've all heard the jokes about Rastas.
We don't agree with it.
Rastas, after being a slave for all his life, reaches the age of about 25, 30, and he gets his freedom.
Immigrants have always posed a problem because the financial infrastructure of a so-called welfare state is tested further and further by every new immigrant, dare I say.
I hope this is going to be witty, George.
It's very witty. In actual fact, it's got certain undertones which are quite subtle.
I would admit I'm not keen on black Rastafarian Africans, Afro-Americans, and yet I find the Asian community delightful.
And he sees his ex-massa riding his big white sign. He said, "Massa," he said,
Did he come from Wales or something?
"Shut up. I'm as good as you are now, Massa." He said, "How do you work that out, Rasta?" He said, "Well, I'm a free man, and you're a free man." He said, "Yeah, Rastas, but I've got a big black stallion."
Yes, I was thinking that. Yes, George and I first started arguing some number of years ago when Thatcher was still in power, and I discovered he was a Thatcherite. I went further left every time I saw him, and he went further right, and he makes Genghis Khan look like a pinko. I think he's well over there, well over on the right.
It occurs to me to ask you, Morgan, seeing that, have you ever made a film with contributors who you didn't like at some level or feel some sense of empathy towards?
I mean, the short answer is no, and it's very important to me to be able to, you know, for people. Well, firstly, people have to like you if they want you to keep coming back and bothering them with a camera, and also if to compel you to come back, it's important to me that I have a strong relationship with them. And it's a different kind of filmmaking, the filmmaking that I've done. Than this. It's filmmaking over a longer period of time. Yeah. So it's quite hard to make a film about somebody you don't like for, you know, over a period of 12 months, a year, you know, 18 months. If you don't like each other, I mean, it's just not going to work that well. But there have been occasions in a couple of films that I've made where not the main characters, but some of the characters in that film that I've had difficulties with. I've had difficulties with the things that they do and the things that they say, and that has caused. It's not a nice situation to be in. I wouldn't choose that situation.
But it's something that, having watched a lot of your films now, I'm thinking that there's always a degree of empathy or sympathy that you feel, a connection with the characters, however unlikely they are, even the kind of hunters, the strange people's attitude towards their animals in taxidermy. The taxidermists were, in some respects, quite unlikable characters, but you found something in them to draw out that was empathetic rather than
Well, you see, I found all of them likable, apart from you know one who was big game hunting and shooting lions, leopards, etc. And not only was it the fact that he was shooting those creatures, which I found very difficult. It was also the fact that he had terrible opinions about life, the world in general, and was just very difficult to be around. So, you know, that was one individual, but the majority of people in that film I thought were sort of wonderful and fascinating, and I could hang out with them, you know, all day. No, it was genuinely a pleasure to make that film.
So let's come back, start looking at some of your work. If we could just have a look at photo 2, which is number 25 on the DVD, please. Coming back to Morgan as a student filmmaker. Here we are, it's the late 80s, judging by the dress. Tell us a little bit about where you went. You grew up in Bristol, obviously a very community-facing family. You decided to go and study where and what path did you take?
Can we get rid of that?
No, we're going to leave it up there as you talk.
So, no, I think I was probably about 16 there, 16, 17, and I'd started an A-level in photography, and although I didn't take that photo, obviously it was my friend who was also on the same course. I developed that sort of fascination with photography, partly because of some of the influences that I've already mentioned. But there came a point when I suppose when the penny dropped that it was actually documentary that I was interested in. But I think at this time, I didn't really know what I was doing particularly, and a bit of a boy about Bristol.
Yes.
And so I wouldn't say I was particularly focused on further education at that time. Probably quite the opposite.
So how did you go on to study film then? Because you went to London School of Printing, is that right?
Yeah, London College of Printing. Yeah, eventually, but I think it took some time. Really, I'd say I was knocking about in Bristol, and with a certain crowd who weren't necessarily going in that direction.
Yeah. Getting in trouble?
Sorry?
Getting in a bit of trouble?
Well, I think a lot of young men kind of have that experience, and certainly people around me. I had a very mixed group of friends, and some of them went to prison, and some of them went to university. And
you became a father very young?
I did, and my lovely daughter is here tonight. I won't embarrass her, but yes, I was very young, and about that age, but actually a bit younger than I was in that photograph.
Do you think that affected your journey a bit and your view of the world that came out in your films, or is it a different track?
I don't know. I just think that possibly, but just generally, I'm just not a judgmental person. I don't because somebody comes from a certain background or has a set of circumstances. That might not be what you would consider normal, or certainly not necessarily straight middle class background. I don't judge people because of that, and equally I don't judge people because they're posh as well. I just generally I think you need as a documentary maker to be able to go into different worlds without being judgmental about them or the people in those worlds. And you need to be able to get on with people from all of those different worlds as well, and in a quite straight way, in a sincere way. And I think people recognise when you're being sincere and when you're not. So yeah, I just think that the fact that I don't if I meet somebody, if they've been in prison, or if I'm filming in a prison, or wherever I am in a drug rehab, etc. I don't necessarily make judgments about those people, but I am interested in them.
And how did you find the culture when you started studying film, the kind of film school culture? Did it kind of stimulate your interest in documentary? Did it stimulate your creativity? What did you take out of it?
Well, no, it certainly did, and I think that I was probably quite lucky to get a place at that time, but it was. It was a great experience for me, and I became very, very focused during that time. And I think that the one thing that I've always done as well since then is, just worked quite hard, and that certainly started during that time when I became very focused on what I wanted to do. So, but it was always documentary whilst I was doing my degree. So a lot of other people around me, most other people were doing fictions and dramas. And which was a great time to be doing that, because as a student filmmaker, you can get actors to come and act for you for nothing, and you've got the resources of the college, although they weren't great. But you do have those at your disposal. But so most people were doing dramas, but for me it was always documentary. Always wanted to do.
Your graduate film we've managed to dig out was called The Child Is Me. Do you want to give it a brief introduction?
Yes, this one hasn't seen the light of day for a while, but it's a film that I made which featured some people from my family, and the person that you're going to see actually is sort of my stepmother, and she's certainly quite posh. And for me, it was my dad met her in a pub, and she was posh but broke, and but she was quite this kind of extraordinary character to me. And I'd never really met anyone properly posh as well. And they got it together and formed this quite kind of unlikely relationship, which still exists today. And I still film them from time to time, and have done over the past kind of 15 years or however long it's been, probably longer. So it was the beginning of that journey. And
should we see a clip?
Yeah.
Short
Is
clip,
it loud
number
enough,
6?
by the way? Do you think the clips are loud enough? Are you hearing them all right? Yeah.
Could be a bit louder. Let's go for clip number 6.
They say families can be full of surprises, and I suppose mine's no exception. In the sense that the man I understood from childhood who was my father, turns out that he was my grandfather. And for purposes of clarity, I refer to him now as Philip George. That's his Christian name. The person I was led to believe was my biological mother, and my mother was in fact no blood relation whatsoever, and I refer to her as Violet Emma. And my half-brother, John, is my father. And at last, having got that, it all starts to make sense.
And Morgan, you have another family connection, which is your uncle is a filmmaker as well. So this is an important, close to the family influence.
It was, yeah, certainly. And you know, James, my uncle James Cohen, who's still very much making films today, and it's not actually that much older than me. There's only a sort of 10-year age gap between us. And so at this time, James was actually making great films, and I'm sure, I mean, although I was having these influences, you know, elsewhere, I'm sure that if it hadn't been for James, I don't know if I would have, you know, leapt in or known that you could make a living out of documentary making, for example. And he was, you know, certainly an inspiration at that time as well. So that at that, when that was 96 or something like that, and James was making films for mostly for Inside Story strand as well. Yeah. And there was at that time, I think, a real, a very interesting and talented school of filmmaking who was involved with that strand, and under Olivia Lichtenstein as well, and Paul Heyman as well, who was connected to that. And James was making films, and I met some of the people involved in those films. Andy Willsmore, who edited 14 Days in May, he was editing films that James was making. So I met people at that time who were doing what I thought was very, very fine filmmaking work.
Should we have a look at one of James's films? You picked this one out in particular. This is clip 7, if we can cue that, Ross. You picked this one out in particular because the protagonist in it became a lifelong friend of yours.
Yeah, Jimmy. It's a film, it's called Love on the Needle, and it's a film that James made. And it's following a story of Jimmy, who is a heroin addict, who was a heroin addict, and him going through cold turkey, trying to kick the habit, going through rehab.
If we could cue that one, please. And again, this is another very made film. You really get a sense that the director's created all the elements.
How did I get here? Out of my head again. It all started for me in 1974, when I was 15. Every weekend, me and my mates would escape from where we lived in Wolverhampton. We'd go to all-night discos all over the country. The best club of all was Wigan Casino. The music we danced to was Northern Soul. When you walk through the doors, the atmosphere used to hit you smack in the face. Bass was pumping, walls were sweating. It was a really good atmosphere. Everybody was happy and high. I started to take speed so I could dance all night. It was like an extended family. Because I was still only 15, I had no money, so I started burgling chemist shops for the speed. Dexedrine, Blueies, Green and Clears, Brown and Clears, black bombers. It wasn't long before I got into heroin. At 16, I was already an addict. At 17, I was behind bars. I've been in prison 3 times, all for drug-related offences. I met my wife, Natalie, 13 years ago. She was 17, I was 25. It was love at first sight. I knew I had to make her mine.
So you have a very strong sense of the director's intervention, creating these elements, creating the stories, not observational documentary, is it?
We're not in the opening. I mean, it was a very stylised opening. And again, I think that sort of school of filmmaking at that time, it was very filmic. I mean, they were shooting on 16mm. The opening, it's sort of reminiscent of numerous feature films that begin with a kind of protagonist, an injured protagonist on a
Lying
bed.
on the bed, staring at the ceiling, you know.
Things like, Carlito's Way, Dog Day Afternoon, Apocalypse Now, all of those films. And using Jimmy's voiceover as well, and some stylised imagery, the tunnels at the beginning, these kind of blue underground tunnels which represent his veins because he was always shooting up, but he was also travelling to score on the undergrounds, and these were sort of visual metaphors that became apparent later in the film. So it was just a very sort of thoughtful way of making a film and constructing a film, but there was also in this film a lot of very intimate observational footage, and they actually rigged the room that Jimmy was going through rehab. They rigged it with cameras in the same way that 24 Hours in A&E and series like that do now, but in slightly less sophisticated way, I'd imagine, but still achieving quite similar results. So it had an amazing intimacy, but also I think the connection between James and Jimmy was very, very strong, and they became very close friends. And as a result, I became very close friends with Jimmy as well. And at one point, we all lived together in a house, me, Jimmy, and James. So it also, I suppose, taught me that the people in your films, they're not subjects. They're not. It's not necessarily a relationship which has kind of barriers.
Yes.
And that those relationships and that trust extends beyond the film.
Yes.
And if you develop very strong bonds, then you obviously you feel a sense of responsibility to the people in your films, but also they open up to you in a way which is quite unique, I suppose, and quite privileged.
So you're being exposed to an extraordinary amount of craft and of innovation of filmmaking, but there's also another big story which collides here, which is a kind of technological revolution, which you talked about them shooting Inside Story in 16mm, but you're about to emerge as the first of a generation, if you like, of self-shooting directors. So is this, you're already self-shooting, videotape has just sort of, blossomed onto the scene. Presumably at film school you're shooting stuff yourself, you're not relying on a cameraman to capture your rushes, and when you leave film school, this is quite a key factor in your professional journey, is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, at this time, sort of level on the needle time, and I was just sort of graduating, and I was shooting little bits. I did some bits on Super 8 for that film. But generally, we were actually still shooting on film, the graduation film, shot on 16mm, a 2-person crew, and that was it. And we were using tracks, and one of us behind the track, the other one on the camera. The same person behind the track would run in front, clap it, and then get behind the track and push it. So that was the way we were making films. But then around that time, DV appeared, DV cameras. And first of all, I mean, we weren't using them in college, but because we could shoot, I mean, essentially I've always thought a camera is a camera, really. And if you can get to grips with one, you can get to grips with another. But in documentary making at that time, apart from a few people like Molly Deneen, who's always been an exceptional self-shooter, but shot on film mostly, there were very distinct roles in documentary, and there was a cameraman, sound man, a director, a producer, etc. So, and those boundaries were rarely crossed. Again, Nick Broomfield, there are exceptions, but it was they were mostly being made with that structure. And then I think when DV came along, and that was about the time that I graduated, and I managed to get a 2-week job. I'd been doing sort of work experience for nothing at Diverse Productions with Roy Ackerman, actually. And I'd been getting some pretty good experience there, but and working on things that were quite, there were Channel 4 shows like Secret Lives with Jeremy Thorpe. I worked on A Cutting Edge with McDonough Benjamin. So I was getting sort of experience on those sorts of films, but not getting paid. And then when I left, I managed to get 2 weeks paid work as a junior, I think my title was junior researcher, at Lion Television, who had just formed an independent company, now quite a big independent company. But this was also at the genesis of docusoaps. So
number 26, please. We'll just show a photo of where Morgan found his first real break. It's going to be a blast from the past.
There's a few faces. There's some group shots, so you might be able to pick out a few faces now. But,
there we go, Paddington Green. So you're in the top left.
I am, yeah.
Who else might we recognise in there? That's some of the cast there.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a much kind of bigger crew that worked on it over the years. And when I started, it was sort of it was a 2-week job to shoot or to create the pilot. It was the development. And at that time, the people working on that, people like Henry Singer, obviously great filmmaker, Nick Murphy as well, who's gone into feature films, is now doing very big feature films. So there were people like that who were working on that pilot, and it was a 2-week job. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, they were like, "Oh, can you do another week?" And then at the end of that week, they were, "Can you do another week?" And it just sort of went on, and I ended up staying there for quite a long time.
And the volume and the speed of it and the morphing together of different roles effectively allows you to accelerate your journey, as it were,
Absolutely.
to start directing quite quickly, yeah?
Well, firstly, there was an explosion of docusoaps at that time. They were very much kind of in vogue, and it was commissioned, I think, Paddington Green. The first commission was 30 parts. And they played at 9 o'clock on BBC One, 30 half hours, which is an extraordinary number.
Yeah.
And
so you start shooting stuff quite quickly.
Well, not initially, because initially we had to fill these 30 half hours, and so we were kind of doing the classic researchers AP's job, but there wasn't really the internet then, so it was sort of door knocking, yellow pages, approaching people in the streets, that sort of thing, trying to find people to fill these 30 hours. But that actually proved quite difficult, and I don't know if anybody lives in Paddington or has any connection to it, but it's not, for me, the most fascinating area. And I think that, combined with the fact that we didn't have access to some of the major institutions, the emergency services, etc., meant that it was a little bit thin on the ground at times. And so the area that we were calling Paddington was sort of ever expanding, and eventually we were looking for people in Kilburn, and they were qualifying as living in Paddington Green. But also the intention was that it was going to be entirely crew shot. But because the characters weren't necessarily that strong, or because we were doing observational filming and not that much was happening, it meant that there were days when the crew would just hardly shoot a tape, and if they did, it wasn't necessarily very good. And then they were restricted to a 10-hour day, and they had an hour for lunch, etc. So, and then I found that because I was going out with my DV camera, shooting recce tapes, getting characters on tape, and that I was able to spend all night in a 24-hour minicab office shooting, and if something happened, great, but if it didn't, it wasn't a big deal. We hadn't spent £1,000 on a crew day. So actually, the DV camera, or my filming, started yielding results. And
well, I think there's not just an economic quality to it, there's also a qualitative difference. I think the clip illustrates that I think here, if we can cue up that clip, Ross, I think there's a quality to what you capture that the crew who knocked off at 6 o'clock that day wouldn't have got. You were following this character as she went off on the lash, and then you also followed her home.
Jackie, the transsexual prostitute in Zante, yes.
Not Paddington at all. We can have a quick glimpse of that.
By 2 o'clock, the party's over.
I'm lonely and I'm unhappy. I came away because I wanted to be happy. I wanted it to be alright, but it's not. I want it to be nice and special, but it's not. I don't want somebody that wants to fuck me. I want somebody to like me. I'd rather a man just hug me and tell me, you're alright, you're nice, you're nice, just nice. But they won't do that because they just don't do that. Men don't do that.
I think even today we're not short of programmes that follow people out getting Jaeger bombed, but you don't often get that far with them. You don't often go home with them. You don't often get their real reflections on how they're feeling. So it strikes me that you, with your DV camera, are getting something that even now is quite difficult to capture.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I don't sort of buy into the idea that you can't capture intimacy with the crew. I mean, you know, look at some of these films that we've shown clips from, and those are all crew shot films. And there are extraordinary moments that are captured with the crew, and it allows you. I mean, it actually kind of liberates you sometimes to shoot with the crew. But it just the sort of as we were finding it, it was proving very difficult to capture that sort of material in the situations that we were in, which weren't necessarily kind of high energy, excitement kind of situations or quite extreme situations. They're actually quite mundane situations. So, to get something that was meaningful within that was quite difficult. And sometimes it was just about, and I've always felt this, that filmmaking, some of the best material that I've filmed has been at the time when the camera is going into the bag. It's whatever time it is in the morning, and the camera's going into the bag, and you're knackered, and everyone's knackered, and then somebody says something, and it's like, oh, one more, and you just get the camera out again and start rolling, and those are the times when sometimes you get to the truth of a situation.
Yes.
But
from here on in, you shoot all of your films, all of these films that have been
pretty much.
So,
pretty much. Yeah. And I mean, although strangely, I was doing that. I was shooting with Kate Townsend, who's now commissioning editor of Storyville, but was directing at that time, and I ended up cutting that film, so producing it. But it wasn't a film, or that series wasn't my series.
No, I'm not suggesting that, but I think what I'm interested in is that from there, your whole career has been with a camera on your shoulder. You're the director and the cameraman always. And
absolutely.
I think that is a revolution that dates back to that time, isn't it?
Absolutely. But I think just the distinction being that at that time it was a sort of house style, that I was kind of working to. Hence the slightly kind of embarrassing piano music that's on that clip, and Ross Kemp's voiceover. Actually, the next clip I think is it's got similarly schmaltzy music, but actually my voiceover instead of Ross Kemp. But it was very much a sort of house style. So I didn't feel that although I was shooting, technically I was directing and cutting these films. I didn't necessarily feel like they were my films, or there was much of me in those films.
Yes.
So then there was the next kind of transition, which is after being at Lion for some time, actually, I moved to Century Films, having been approached by them, but also being a great admirer of Brian Hill's films at that time, who was making films like Drinking for England and Saturday Night, which are sort of great poetic films, but also capture this amazing scenes, again, all shot with a crew, but very intimate, very powerful, and sort of genre defining with his use of poetry and music as well. So I was lured over there quite easily.
To come now to your first real owned film that you made for BBC 4, I think, is that right? The Care House?
Yeah, and I did a few things at Century, and then ended up... it was meant to be a collaboration with Brian Hill that we were both going to be directing on, I suppose. And it was based in a care home in York, a care home for people with learning difficulties. But I ended up falling in love with the place so much, and living in York practically, living in the care home practically, and became a sort of fixture in the home. That at some point Richard Klein, who had commissioned it at the BBC in the very, very early days of BBC 4, and Brian decided that this should be my film, and it was a 90-minute film, and I would say it was probably the first film that I felt kind of represented me in some way.
Shall we have a look at that? That's clip number 12, please.
Peter is one of the more independent residents who was hardly ever in the house. Most of the time, he was out on a date somewhere with his girlfriend, Debbie. Many of the residents would really love to be in a relationship, but currently Peter is the only one who's managed it. They've been a couple for over a year, and now Peter thinks they are ready to take the next step.
Look at that. I'll go that side.
Smile, everybody, smile. Come on.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, I feel very happy with her because she's everything I've been looking for.
Is it love?
Yes, it is, yes.
How do you know it's love?
Because we never argue. We've had 3 arguments in a year. I've been speaking to John, and he said I've got to wait for 2 years and to see how things go. And then we're going to have a discussion in the office, and then hopefully I'll be moving out.
So anyone who claims the Undateables on Channel 4 is original should dig out the care home. Morgan, you seem slightly self-conscious about the fact that you voiced that yourself. Is that because I don't think most people would have even noticed. I certainly didn't the first time I looked at it, but you've drawn attention to it a couple of times. What about you?
Well, I think I felt uncomfortable about doing it for the first time, and it wasn't something that I particularly wanted to do, and I never sort of saw myself as a filmmaker who put themselves in a film like that. But at the first viewing that we had with Richard, there's a lot. I mean, that clip, there's a little bit of interaction between me and Peter, but there were other scenes where I was just a lot more kind of involved in what was going on, and there's a lot more kind of back and forth, and they asked, the residents were asking me questions as much as I was asking them questions. And so essentially there was quite a lot of me in the film, but the first rough cut that I showed Richard, there was no voiceover. And he said at that time, well, you clearly have to voice it because you're in the film so much.
Yes.
And it was something, it was something that I wasn't really comfortable with. I just didn't really want to do it particularly. But I think at that time as well, there was also a bit of a vogue for authored documentaries, authored observational documentaries.
Are you conscious of the degree of subjectivity of your presence in the film as a filmmaker?
What I understand now is that there's a time and a place for it, and if there is very strong evidence of your interaction with the people in your film, and if they're referring to you, and if your voice is in it, and if what you're saying and what you're doing has some relevance to what you're filming, then absolutely you should probably be included in that film as a character, if you like, which might include using your voice or voicing the film. In other situations, and I think although around this time there were several films that I made that I did voice, I haven't done that for a while, and there are films that I've made about subjects where it's felt totally irrelevant to have my voice in there. And that, it's not a longitudinal film, it's not a film where I've built up an enormous relationship with people, and therefore my kind of voice or opinion in that situation doesn't seem relevant.
Yes. We're going to come on a bit later to talk about your company that you founded, Minnow Films, and your current work. But before that, there's a kind of period now where you make your kind of key films that build your reputation from this starting point with Care House. My Crazy Parents is a series that you make for Channel 4. Quitters is a film that you make with Jimmy, the heroin addict from Love on the Needle. Beautiful Young Minds we've seen a clip of. I'm conscious of time a bit, so what I think we should do is show a couple of the clips, the really, really big, powerful clips from a couple of these massive documentaries you've done for the BBC, and then try and talk about them a bit as a whole, as a body of work. It strikes me that there's something about this body of work that is characterised by quite vulnerable, quite raw people and quite a powerful sense of engagement between you and them. Are you conscious of choosing subjects in that way?
I'm conscious of choosing subjects that mean something to me, or that are meaningful in some way, and I don't really know any other way to approach documentary. But that doesn't mean that it has to be a big, heavy subject. And some of the films that I've made, you could describe them as being about big, heavy subjects. But I've also made films about the World Hairdressing Championships and
pigeon fanciers,
and which go back to my interest in animals and people and and obsessions, because obsessions are fascinating for me, and I think if people are obsessed with something and you can convey that obsession and that enthusiasm, then it can become very infectious. And do
you ever worry that the audience is mocking or that the audience is critical? Does that concern you?
I think it's I think it's important to have humour in a film, and even the films I've made about death or grief, I would say there's some humour in those films, partly because in this country we often deal with grief through humour, but also that's just natural, and it reflects it reflects us, and it reflects society, I suppose. But then there are some films that I've made which I suppose are overtly humorous in subject from the beginning. But that doesn't mean that they're a laughingstock, or they make a laughingstock out of the people in them, because again, I think it's about making those people endearing. And actually, you don't necessarily have to work very hard to make them endearing, because they are anyway.
Yes.
Certainly to me.
And films like Taxidermy kind of present in quite an entertaining way. You feel like you're being drawn into a film that's going to be funny, and that the characters are going to be slightly absurd. And yet they then surprise you with the degree of engagement that they're able to create with the characters. It might be useful to look at a clip of that, because of all the clips that we've got coming up, that's probably the only one that demonstrates that real lightness of touch. Some of the others are naturally drawn to the stronger material. Shall we look at Taxidermy?
Sure.
This is clip 16, please.
Sit on his back and hold him up like that. Like you're riding a big horse.
Just stand like this?
No, sit on him. You're not going to hurt him.
It's gushing.
Is it?
Yes. It's actually funny.
I'll let you yank all the heart and everything out of him.
Sweet.
There's his intestines starting to fall out already.
Cool.
So I'm just taking my time. There's his stomach starting to pooch out. So you cut that, we will all be throwing up. So now when we get up to the chest cavity,
cool.
You're going to see a whole bunch of blood come out, because that's where you popped his lungs and everything.
Whoa, that is cool.
There you go. Have a heart.
That's cool. It's one, too.
You never seen a guy and his daughter have this much fun in a grocery store before, have we?
It's boring. Out here, it's fun.
It's so right and it's so wrong. I mean, I feel really conflicted as I'm watching that. Are you conscious of that as you're using that material, that that's what you're trying to invoke in your viewer?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just think it kind of is what it is, really, in that situation. And that's what they did. That's what they do. And I'm aware how people might react to that, or that they might react quite strongly to that. But there's no what I would call manipulation. And although it's, you could say it's judgmental, but not automatically for me, because that's quite natural for them to do that. And it's for the guy with his daughter, that's a real moment. Her shooting her first deer, they'll take that deer home, they'll mount it, stuff it, and they'll eat it, you know, as well. And so, you know, they have a way of life, and I think that the film demonstrates that. And although it might be a way of life which is quite alien to lots of us, or quite weird, or possibly horrific, again, for me, you know, I don't automatically judge people in that situation. I don't.
Yes.
I don't know if there's. I mean, is it wrong? Maybe?
No. I find it fascinating. I mean, I think it would be wrong for us not to show clips from a couple of your. In the last few years, there have been a couple of very, very powerful films. Two in particular that you've done for the BBC. The Fallen, which was a 3-hour documentary, but won numerous prizes, which listed the names of all those who've fallen in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is that right?
It was at the time every single British soldier in Afghanistan and Iraq that we named, and featured many of the stories in quite a lot of detail. And it was a 3-hour long commission, so it was a very unusual commission, a single 3-hour film commissioned for the BBC. And at that time there were 300 soldiers, British soldiers, who'd been killed in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now there's a lot more. And I think I very naively thought at that time that by making a film like this, that death toll might not continue to go up so rapidly, but it did.
Let's have a look at a scene from The Fallen. I remember watching this as part of an awards jury and being gobsmacked by the 3-hour running time, but then completely drawn in by the power of the documentary storytelling and the power of the grief, frankly, of the people in the frame. If we could have clip number 18, please. And also, it's one of those. The military is one of those rare places where toffs and oiks live in the same place, and you've got this extraordinary polarisation of class. And here you see, in this clip, you see a Glaswegian family. Is that right? And then
from Durham.
From Durham.
Yeah. And they lost their son. He was 18, 19, went into the army, first job kind of thing, and ended up dying very shortly into his first tour of duty. Yeah.
So that clip, please.
You have to lift the thing up.
Do you mind?
No. You have to lift it right up.
What does it say at the top?
The rifles, then it's got his bugle, then it's got Fallen Hero, because that's where he was.
And when did you get that done?
About 3 weeks ago. He was like a lag in the Jack Daniels for a chaser. So now and again I have one of them for him.
Are you drinking more now as well as a...
Oh, that's all we do, drink.
And how much are you drinking in a day?
Put it this way, can't lost because we come home in some states. Some bonny states.
Perhaps you're forgetting that, things like that. It's the next morning when you wake up, it's the same again. It's exactly the same again. End of the story. I lost my fucking Ben and I loved him a bit. He's my baby. He fucking right, no? Right, he's my baby. He's kisses on the cheek and everything. Dad, I love you. How? What? How the fuck? What the fucking? And I lost him. I've lost a son what I shouldn't even sign for. I shouldn't even sign that name for him to go in the army. Because I knew what was going on over there. Yeah, wrap it in, man.
Right, I'm only going to tell you once.
What?
This is a documentary for my dead son.
That's
so
all right.
Stop pointing. The camera's not even pointing at you.
Listen,
it's not pointing at you.
Right.
It's not pointing at you.
My face.
It's not looking at your face. Who wants to look at your face? This is for my son.
That's all right.
It's for my son. The camera's not even looking at you.
That's okay then.
Why don't you stand on that man? It's got nothing to do with you.
Right.
Turn the other way. I'll shove the camera up you and then mind the camera man. Aye, will you? Fuck off.
Eh? I don't plan the first, so I don't plan the first.
One off you all lot?
No, just get me one. Never fucking her, just get me one. She's out all night, man. I go home early.
Do you?
Go home early. I sit in the sitting room like a prick, like I always do. Light a candle.
That's an good day, that though.
And where have I gone wrong? That's what I do, where have I gone wrong? But that's me. It's fucking me up there.
Because you loved them.
I'm 61-year-old now, you know.
Yeah.
Another fucking pint, I'm going home anyway.
Oh, yeah.
I'm fucking done with the gun, man. Oh, son, that.
What's our Foster's at?
Pint of Foster's.
I'd like to roll straight into clip 19 out of the interest of time, because both clips have a very strong theme in common, and it would be useful to come back and talk about them both. And I'm conscious that I want to leave a bit of time for you guys to ask some questions of Morgan at the end. So if we can roll straight into the next one. This is called Scenes from a Teenage Killing, which took some of the same idea of the falling away of, you listed all the young people who've been killed in stabbing incidents in Britain.
Any teenager who had died as a result of violence in a single year.
Right.
And we featured all of them, and there were 45 in the year that we chose, 2009.
We're gathered here to weep over the death of yet another young child. I don't know about you, but I am frustrated. When will we cease standing here with a young person who should not be in a coffin there? Roy will tell you, Sandra will tell you, it's unnatural. I read the tribute from Roy. He said, nobody knows but God how I feel. I never thought I would be burying my son. It is unnatural for parents to bury their children. Let me tell you something. The power of change lies in the hands of the community. It lies in the hands of the people, not the politicians. No one else but us. There is a disproportionate amount of black youth dying on the street, and I am tired of it.
Brothers and sisters, our funeral for Jamal is drawing to a close. In a few moments' time, each and every one of us will have the opportunity to come and file past the coffin. My friends, these are precious, precious moments.
When the coffin was opened, we heard an absolute shriek. It was at that moment, really, where effectively the boundaries somehow went.
And if your name,
But there was a real sense of kind of mania outside. There was a real manic experience. I mean, the first I heard of it was when we were processing the coffin out, and my colleague, Father David, said, you know, stop the procession, there's a fight going on.
Get the kids away from here, man.
Yeah, take a beef somewhere else. I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, roll up.
I was told that it's because there were some boys from E8 that apparently that shouldn't have been where we were, and where we was E9, and they're from E8, and it's literally like E8 and E9 is like, it's literally the same place, and they was told not to come over there, and they came over there, so they wanted them to go back where they came from.
So what, these were boys who weren't there for the funeral?
No, there was boys that weren't there for the funeral, came to fight the boys that was at the funeral. Isn't that sick?
And it kind of beggars belief, it really does. I'm like, you know, I find it so difficult to get my head around as to, you know, at one level there is this talk of respect and, you know, don't disrespect me and all this sort of stuff. and at the same time showing such a complete and utter lack of respect for a family who are grieving, for a community which is hurting, for close friends whose hearts are crying out in pain. And I just don't understand it.
These scenes and these films are really difficult to watch. Do you find them difficult to make? I mean, they must impact on you emotionally.
Yeah, I mean, inevitably they're difficult to make, but I mean, you know, in a way, all films are difficult to make, and sometimes if you're making a film about something that's not particularly meaningful, it's harder to dredge something out of it that is meaningful. And this, for me, both of these subjects and these films were meaningful from the outset. So it feels like you're doing something that's worth doing. At the same time, if people want you to be there and they're happy for you to be there and happy for you to talk to them and for them to talk to you and to open up about it, then it feels purposeful and it feels like it doesn't, it feels quite profound and it feels quite humbling as well. So, you know, it doesn't, although sometimes you're around very, very difficult situations, it allows you a sort of a sense of doing something, I suppose, that's kind of worth doing, and I don't mean in a kind of worthy kind of way, and it just feels kind of meaningful, I suppose, whilst you're doing it, and as long as people want you there, then it feels okay.
They feel quite community-facing as well. Do you think you're influenced by your background, by the milieu in which you grew up, that there's a kind of strong sense of conscience running through your films?
Well, inevitably, yes, but I think that, you know, most documentary makers have that in common, because otherwise, why do you want to make films about people? You know, if you don't care about people, and if you don't care about people on all different kind of, you know, levels, if you like, or from all kinds of different backgrounds, then, you know, why would you be interested?
Some people seem more motivated by anger or criticism, which I don't sense in you. I don't see that in your films.
Well, I suppose that's a different kind of filmmaking, and, you know, if it's an issue-based film, if it's current affairs, if it's, you know, whatever it might be, if it's a polemic, you know, that might be a different kind of filmmaking. But I've always found the stories, if you like, of, you know, ordinary people, you know, whatever that means, to be quite extraordinary, and that kind of privilege of being in a room with somebody and then telling you things which are really just incredible, and possibly things that they haven't told people before, but certainly things that you feel very privileged to capture on tape and share with an audience. That is really quite an incredible and privileged experience that I don't think I'll ever tire of that.
Yes.
You know, those moments when that happens are very powerful and remain so.
So having reached this stage where you're making these amazing films, garlanded with awards, it feels you can...
I haven't won that many, by the way.
Well, you know, so many nominations. It's
lots of nominations.
That it can't be, is it relatively easy for you to get commissioned as a director? You then took a harder path and set up a company, TV production being probably the worst business model anyone's ever invented, particularly for small and medium-sized indies, which are notoriously difficult to start as businesses. Why would you choose to do that? What motivated you, Morgan, to set up Minnow Film?
Well, I can't say it was particularly thought through at the time, and it was more of a sort of natural progression in the way that I was making films quite independently. After Century Films, I went to Blast Films, and I was making films like Beautiful Young Minds there. But doing that, you know, relatively independently, and I think Simon Dixon, I don't know if he's here, but I saw him milling around earlier on, and he was somebody who said, well, why don't you set up your own company and we'll commission you, Channel 4 will commission you, and so I did, and Channel 4 did give me my first commission, which was a film about the Greenpeace anti-whaling campaign, and I went on my own on a Greenpeace ship down to the Antarctic to, in theory, do battle with the Japanese whalers, except that they didn't show up. So we were sort of roaming around the seas for about 2 months, although we did eventually find them when they set their own ship on fire. But it didn't really work out. But but it's still quite an interesting film as a result of that. You know, that unexpected situation, which again, you know, for me is you go into a documentary not knowing what you're going to get. You know,
and how do you find it as a creative person working with other directors and other talents? Is it do you still feel that you make your mark, because you've been execing things, you exec Fighting on the Front Line, which is an utterly brilliant series for Channel 4 about fighting in Afghanistan. Daisy Asquith's just made a film for Channel 4 with you about Holocaust survivors. How are you finding this different sort of relationship with the material that you have when you're working with other directors?
Well, again, I think it's a sort of natural progression, and one that, you know, I'm interested in doing different things and at different times, you know, as you get older, I suppose. And I've been making films in a certain way for some time. Now I'm interested in making films in a slightly different way. I've just made Britain in a Day, which is showing here tomorrow and is something totally different for me, but you know, quite fascinating to do. And then as an exec, there's quite a lot happening at Minnow to keep across. We've got 2 films playing here tomorrow, actually. Ben Anthony's film about 7/7, and also a film which is a co-production. The working title is Glory Road, about Liverpudlian boxers on their way to the Olympics. But you know, I suppose that just feels like a natural progression again. And what I enjoy is being involved in films that have some integrity and quality, made by filmmakers who also have integrity and quality and talent. Some first-time filmmakers, or relatively inexperienced filmmakers, several filmmakers who have come through Minnow to make their first films. And Minnow I really see as a home for people. It's a place, you know, I'm very proud of Minnow, but very proud of the people who work there. And Claire Voice, who is our head of production, is you know, a wonderful person who I think makes everybody at Minnow feel very welcome and makes a very good home for them. And hence, you know, it's a place where people like to stay, I hope. But people who make their first films there, but also very experienced filmmakers, like John Dow has just made a film with us, Henry Singer's made a film with us, Daisy Asquith, you know, Ben Anthony tomorrow. You know, these are all kind of top line filmmakers as well. So, you know, I hope it's a place that attracts talent, and as a result of that produces very good films, which I'm proud to be a part of and proud to say came out of Minnow.
We were hoping to end on a clip of Britain in a Day, but in favour of offering you the chance to ask Morgan any further questions, can we ask the house lights to come up and suggest that you all go and see Britain in a Day tomorrow and see the whole thing rather than a clip? There's a couple of people around with microphones. Does anyone have any questions to throw at Morgan? Yes, gentleman over here.
Hello, my name is Tatenda. I'm a Zimbabwean cinematographer, and I'm here with Second Light Documentary Film Lab. And as a aspiring documentary filmmaker, I've had this question in terms of when you make a documentary which you feel very closely to. I mean, in terms of, let's say, The Fallen, etc. You said that you wanted to have a social impact. As someone who's coming from the black community, for me, you see sort of documentaries about gun and knife crime and other issues as well. However, nothing really continues thereafter. So the question that I have for you is, do you maintain a relationship with sort of organizations within those communities, or for documentary filmmakers, how can you maintain a relationship and for you to further create that link and to have a positive impact?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's an important point, because we make these films. You might spend 18 months longer making a single film. It goes out, maybe it's shown. Now films can have you know, a longer lifespan in that, you know, they stay on for on demand, on the iPlayer, on YouTube. But you know, there is that sense that it goes out and then it kind of disappears. And with a film that you want to have some kind of impact, it is important that you're making that kind of available to people. And something like Scenes from a Teenage Killing, we were involved in the Good Pitch, which is run by BritDoc, and we were part of that from the outset. So we started engaging with different organisations who were involved in tackling violence or knife crime, and also people working with young offenders or people at risk of offending. And you know, actually, it was quite difficult in a way to sort of maintain or make those relationships productive. But what we were inviting people to use the film and offering it to them, obviously for nothing, to use in whatever capacity they could in their work. And we were certainly approached after that film went out by a number of different organisations who wanted to use it in their work. So, and it still obviously exists and still is around, and people can get hold of it. But as to how you maintain these relationships, well, you just maintain these relationships. You keep in touch with people, and I'm still in touch with some people from that film. Not everybody, but they were involved recently in the film. There was a young man who was killed in Bristol called Shevon Wilson, and at the site near where he was killed, they erected his friends a bench, which became a sort of memorial site. And some people, his friends and family, wanted to make this a permanent site, and they were raising money and getting involved in a campaign to make it a permanent peace garden. But there was quite a lot of opposition in the community as well, and I was involved in that I suppose campaign to preserve that site. So there are ways of keeping in touch with people and maintaining those relationships.
Do you see if anyone else wants to ask a question? Any hands? Yeah, Russell.
Morgan, I just had a quick question about editing. Your films are incredibly crafted, not only in the shooting style, but in the way they're put together and the cutting and everything. And I wondered how you work with the editor. Do you cut yourself? Do you have a regular editor? Do you give it to an editor? And how does that relationship work?
Well, it's different. I certainly don't cut myself, and it's the one thing that I will probably never do. And I shoot and I record the sound and I direct, but I don't edit. And I value the relationship with the editor enormously. And I've worked with a number of great editors, and Joby G, who cut The Fallen, and recently Peter Christelis, who cut Britain in a Day. And they all tend to work in quite a different way, but I would say it's just, it's as I'm sure you know, quite an intense relationship, but not one, I rarely fall out with editors, and that's partly because I tend to work with editors who have a really great temperament and are quite tolerant. And I would say that I probably push it quite a lot in the edit, and it's probably quite challenging for them. As I'd imagine most directors are quite particular about things. So, we work very hard to try and get the best out of the material and make the best possible film. So it is challenging for them.
I think we've got time for one more question, if anyone has one. Yeah, down here. You're first up with your hand.
Yeah, in terms of, I know you self-shooting, and but how do you prefer to work? Do you have an assistant with you, very concretely? Do you have an assistant with you, or what's your preferred setup?
Sometimes, early on I was often making films, I was out shooting by myself, recording the sound. Now I wouldn't do that, and for a long time I haven't really done that. And I've tended to work with a very strong producer, who's your right-hand person, and they're often recording the sound, but they're doing a lot more. They're doing a lot more as well as that, and whether it's the access or just enormous amounts of work that they're doing in terms of the preparation whilst you're shooting, after you're shooting. Very, very strong producers that I've worked with, and David Brindley, who I don't think is here but is coming tomorrow, Ruth Kelly, who I think is up there, and Katie Bailiff at Century, people who are very, very good producers, and that's been invaluable for me, especially with productions which are quite sort of, I suppose, quite epic in scale and involve very difficult access issues and quite sensitive issues. So it's very important to have a right-hand person, a sort of filming partnership, if you like.
I think we're going to have to regrettably wrap up there. We skipped over a number of clips. We didn't see the brilliant Nick Broomfield clip. We didn't see Fighting on the Front Line. We didn't have time for it all. So please check out all of Morgan's films. Britain for a Day is showing here. Glory Road, which is part of our True Stories strand on Channel 4, is showing here. And the 7/7 film that he mentioned. I'd like to just say thanks to Helen Lillis at Channel 4 and to Gareth Morgan for the huge work that went into putting all the clips together. I hope you'll all leave here and join us for the Channel 4 drinks party down at the Queen's Club. Apparently there's a hog roast and drinks are on us tonight, so you're all welcome. I think that starts now. And it remains just for all of us to say thank you very much to Morgan for telling us and sharing us.